The most dangerous mistake a person can make is judging someone before knowing the name they carry. Those words were never spoken that morning, but they would become the lesson everyone remembered after one unexpected encounter outside Fort Harrison Military Base in Virginia. The sun had just begun rising over the wide training fields, casting a golden light across the roads where soldiers moved between buildings and vehicles prepared for another day of duty. Everything appeared normal. The base was active, organized, and disciplined. But near the main entrance, a quiet misunderstanding was about to become a moment that would change how everyone saw authority. Standing near the security checkpoint was a man wearing a simple dark jacket and carrying a small folder in his hand. He did not have a military uniform. He did not have an escort. He did not display any medals or signs of his position. To anyone passing by, he looked like an ordinary visitor arriving for a meeting. His name was Elijah Carter, but most people there did not know that name yet. For decades, Elijah had served the United States Army with dedication and honor. He had made decisions that carried enormous responsibility. He had guided soldiers, advised leaders, and built a reputation based not on attention, but on trust. Yet on this morning he was not looking for recognition. He simply wanted to walk through the base and complete his scheduled visit. That was when Officer Ryan Mitchell noticed him. Ryan was responsible for security around the entrance area. He had spent years watching people enter and leave the facility. He believed his job was to protect the base, and he took that responsibility seriously. But sometimes, a person can become so focused on identifying possible problems that they forget the importance of understanding the person standing in front of them. Ryan approached Elijah and asked a few questions. Elijah responded politely and explained that he was expected inside the facility. His voice was calm. His manner was respectful. But Ryan remained uncertain. He looked at the situation through a narrow perspective. A man without a uniform. A man without visible identification, showing his importance. A man standing in a place where Ryan believed every detail needed to be questioned. "You need to explain why you are here," Ryan said. Elijah looked at him quietly for a moment, not with anger, not with frustration, but with the patience of someone who had spent a lifetime learning the value of staying composed under pressure. "I understand your responsibility, officer," Elijah replied. "But sometimes the first thing we need to protect is our judgment." The words were simple, but they carried a deeper meaning. Around them, a few soldiers passing nearby began to notice the conversation. Something about Elijah's presence felt different. It was not about appearance. It was not about clothing. It was the way he stood, the way he listened, and the way he carried himself. Ryan did not recognize those details. Not yet. He only saw the situation in front of him and believed he already understood the truth. But the truth was much larger than that moment. The man standing quietly near the entrance was not an ordinary visitor. He was a four-star general whose leadership had shaped the lives of countless soldiers. And within minutes, the entire base would learn that the person they underestimated was someone they had spent years respecting. The morning continued at Fort Harrison Military Base, but the atmosphere near the entrance had started to feel different. What began as a simple conversation between a security officer and a visitor slowly became a moment where assumptions were being tested. Elijah Carter remained calm, standing exactly where he had been since the beginning. He did not raise his voice. He did not demand special treatment. He simply waited, allowing the situation to unfold naturally. For someone who had spent decades making decisions under pressure, patience was not a weakness. It was a skill developed through years of experience. Long before this morning, Elijah had learned that leadership was not about how quickly someone could respond. It was about understanding when silence could reveal more than words. Throughout his career in the United States Army, Elijah had stood beside people from every background imaginable. He had watched young soldiers enter service with different stories, different challenges, and different reasons for wearing the uniform. But once they stood together, one principle remained the same. Respect had to come before recognition. That lesson stayed with him now as Officer Ryan Mitchell continued asking questions. Ryan looked at Elijah carefully, still trying to understand why this man seemed completely unaffected by the situation. Most people who were questioned at a military entrance became nervous. They rushed to explain themselves. They tried to prove they belonged. Elijah did not. He simply answered each question with the same steady tone. "I understand you have a responsibility here," Elijah said. "I respect that. But responsibility also requires fairness." Ryan listened, but he still viewed the situation through the assumptions he had already created. He noticed the simple clothing. He noticed the lack of an escort. He noticed that Elijah did not look like the image he expected from someone important. But appearances had always been a poor measure of a person's true value. That was a lesson Elijah had learned many times during his years of service. Some of the greatest leaders he had known were not always the loudest people in the room. They were often the ones who listened first. They were the ones who stayed composed when others expected a reaction. Near the checkpoint, several soldiers began quietly observing the interaction. They did not know exactly what was happening, but they noticed something unusual about Elijah. There was a confidence in the way he carried himself. Not arrogance. Not a desire to control the moment. Something different. A quiet discipline that came from experience. One young soldier looked at Elijah for a few seconds longer than the others. Something about him felt familiar. The posture. The calm expression. The way he spoke with respect while still standing firmly. But before the soldier could say anything, the moment continued. Ryan checked the information available to him and remained uncertain. He believed he was simply doing his job. He believed he was protecting the base. Yet the most important part of his responsibility was not just identifying who should enter. It was understanding who was standing in front of him. Elijah looked toward the buildings beyond the entrance. Somewhere inside, people were already preparing for his arrival. Officers who knew his name. Soldiers who had learned from his leadership. Individuals who understood the impact of his service. But outside the gate, one person still saw only what was immediately visible. Ryan saw a man without a uniform. He did not yet see the general behind the simple clothes. He did not yet understand that the person he was questioning was someone whose decisions had influenced the very institution he was trying to protect. And as the minutes passed, the truth was getting closer to being revealed. The entrance of Fort Harrison military base remained busy, but the attention of several people was now quietly drawn toward the same place. The conversation between Officer Ryan Mitchell and Elijah Carter had lasted much longer than anyone expected. To Ryan, it was still a security matter that needed to be handled. To Elijah, it was a moment that revealed something much deeper. The difference between them was not simply their roles. It was the way they understood responsibility. Ryan believed his job was to identify anything unusual before it became a problem. Elijah believed true leadership required seeing the person before seeing the situation. "Officer Mitchell," Elijah said calmly, "protecting a place also means protecting the values that place represents." Ryan looked at him with uncertainty. He respected the confidence in Elijah's voice, but he still could not understand why this man refused to become frustrated. He expected resistance. He expected arguments. Instead, he found patience. And that patience made him question the situation more than any explanation could have. Elijah had spent most of his adult life surrounded by people who understood the importance of discipline. As a 4-star general in the United States Army, he had learned that every decision created a reaction. A careless word could affect morale. A rushed judgment could affect trust. That was why he valued listening. It was not because he lacked authority. It was because he understood the responsibility that came with having it. But Ryan did not know any of that. He only saw a man standing outside a military facility without a uniform. He did not see the years of dedication behind that calm expression. He did not see the countless early mornings, difficult decisions, and moments of leadership that shaped Elijah Carter into the person he had become. Around the entrance, the small group of observers continued growing. A few soldiers exchanged quiet looks. One of them, Sergeant Daniel Brooks, had recently returned from a training assignment and noticed something familiar about Elijah. He could not immediately explain it, but there was something about the man's presence that felt recognizable. It was the way he stood, the way he listened, the way others naturally paid attention when he spoke. "I have seen that posture before," Daniel quietly said to another soldier nearby. But before anyone could approach, Ryan continued the conversation. "If you are supposed to be here, then there should be someone who can confirm it," Ryan said. Elijah nodded. "That is fair." His response surprised Ryan. He expected an argument. He expected someone to use influence or status to avoid questions. Instead, Elijah accepted the process, because Elijah had never believed that rules were the problem. The problem came when people stopped applying them with fairness. He looked at Ryan and said, "The same standard should apply to everyone." That sentence stayed with the people nearby. It was not a demand. It was not a threat. It was simply a reminder of a principle that every person could understand. Ryan stepped away briefly to check additional information. He still believed he was doing the right thing. But somewhere in his mind, a small doubt had started to appear. The confidence he carried at the beginning was beginning to compete with a new question. What if he had misunderstood the person standing in front of him? Inside the base, people were beginning to hear that there was an unexpected situation near the entrance. A few senior personnel started asking questions. They wanted to know why a visitor was being delayed. They wanted to understand what was happening outside. And as those questions moved through the base, one fact was getting closer to being discovered. The man standing near the gate was not someone trying to enter a place where he did not belong. He was someone who had spent years helping lead the very people who worked there. The truth was still hidden, but it was no longer far away. The atmosphere near the entrance of Fort Harrison Military Base continued to change with every passing minute. What had started as a routine security conversation had become something much harder to ignore. More people were beginning to notice the unusual situation, not because anyone was raising their voice, but because of the quiet confidence of the man standing in the middle of it all. Elijah Carter remained exactly the same as when he first arrived. Calm, respectful, patient. He did not look around for approval. He did not search for someone to rescue him from the misunderstanding. He simply waited, allowing the truth to reveal itself at its own pace. Officer Ryan Mitchell returned after checking the information available to him. He still believed he was following proper procedure, but something had changed. The certainty he carried earlier was no longer as strong. There was a question in his mind that he could not ignore. Why did this man seem so comfortable in a situation where most people would feel pressured? "I need you to understand that this is a restricted military area," Ryan said. Elijah nodded. "I understand." "Then you should also understand why we have to be careful," Ryan continued. Elijah looked toward the base entrance and then back at the officer. "Careful is important, but careful should never become careless judgment." The words were quiet, but they reached everyone nearby. A few soldiers standing close to the checkpoint exchanged looks. They were not used to hearing someone speak with that level of calm authority. There was no attempt to dominate the conversation. There was no desire to embarrass anyone. There was only a reminder that every person deserved to be treated with fairness. Ryan looked at Elijah and still struggled to understand the situation. In his mind, important people usually arrived with obvious signs of importance. They wore uniforms. They had escorts. They had people announcing their arrival. Elijah had none of those things, and that was exactly why Ryan failed to recognize him. He was searching for a symbol instead of seeing the person. Inside the base, the conversation was beginning to spread. A few personnel had heard that there was a delay at the entrance involving an unknown visitor. Senior officers started asking questions because they knew something unusual was happening. Elijah Carter was expected that morning, but not everyone at the gate knew the details of his arrival. The information moving through the base was incomplete, but one thing was becoming clear. Someone important was waiting outside. Sergeant Daniel Brooks continued watching from a distance. The more he observed Elijah, the more familiar the man seemed. Daniel had spent years around military leaders, and he knew there was something different about the way Elijah carried himself. It was not about appearance. It was not about trying to impress anyone. It was the quiet confidence of someone who had spent a lifetime making decisions and accepting responsibility for them. Elijah noticed the growing attention but remained focused on Ryan. "Officer," he said, "I know you are trying to do your job. That matters. But every person deserves to be seen clearly before they are judged." Ryan looked at him silently. For the first time, he considered the possibility that he had been looking at the situation from only one direction. The entrance behind Elijah represented a place built on discipline, service, and respect. Yet the man standing outside had been treated as if those values did not apply to him. The irony was becoming harder to ignore. Then, from inside the base, footsteps approached. A senior military officer was making his way toward the entrance after hearing the name connected to the situation. The people nearby turned their attention toward the approaching figure. Elijah remained calm. Ryan remained uncertain. And somewhere between those two moments was the truth that was about to change everything. The footsteps approaching from inside Fort Harrison military base grew closer, and the quiet tension near the entrance became impossible to ignore. The people standing nearby turned their attention toward the person walking across the facility grounds. Officer Ryan Mitchell watched carefully, still unsure what was happening. He had expected a simple explanation, a routine confirmation, and a quick resolution. Instead, the situation had become something much larger. Elijah Carter remained calm as he stood beside the checkpoint. He did not look nervous. He did not look concerned. He looked like someone who understood that the truth did not need to be forced. It only needed time to appear. The senior officer approaching the entrance was Colonel Thomas Walker, a respected leader at Fort Harrison who had worked closely with the highest levels of Army command. As he got closer, his expression changed. At first, he simply noticed the situation. Then he recognized the man standing there. The calm visitor. The simple jacket. The quiet confidence. In that instant, everything around him seemed to slow down. "General Carter?" Colonel Walker said. The words were not loud, but everyone nearby heard them. Ryan looked toward Elijah, then back at the approaching officer. For a moment, he said nothing. The name carried a meaning he had not expected. The person he had been questioning was not an unknown visitor trying to enter the base. He was the four-star general whose leadership was respected throughout the Army. Elijah gave a small nod. "Colonel Walker." His voice remained steady. There was no anger in his response. No desire to make the moment uncomfortable for anyone. That surprised Ryan more than the revelation itself. He expected someone with that level of authority to immediately express frustration. Instead, Elijah remained exactly the same person he had been from the beginning. Calm, professional, fair. Colonel Walker looked at Ryan and then back at Elijah. He understood the seriousness of the situation, but he also understood something else. General Carter was not interested in creating a scene. He was interested in understanding what had happened and why. "General, we were not expecting you to arrive this way," Colonel Walker said. Elijah smiled slightly. "Sometimes it is useful to see things without everyone knowing who you are." Those words made several people think. Because Elijah had not hidden his identity because he was ashamed of it. He had simply wanted to experience the moment as an ordinary person. He wanted to see how people responded when they had no reason to treat him differently. Ryan stood quietly, processing everything that had happened. The realization was becoming clearer. The issue was never whether Elijah had the proper authority to enter. The issue was how quickly assumptions had replaced understanding. A few soldiers nearby began recognizing the significance of the moment. They had heard General Carter's name before. They knew his reputation. They knew the years of service behind that simple appearance. The man who had been standing alone near the entrance was someone many of them had looked up to throughout their careers. Elijah turned toward Ryan. "Officer Mitchell," he said calmly, "I want you to remember something. Procedures exist for a reason. They protect people. They create order. But they work best when they are guided by fairness." Ryan listened carefully. For the first time that morning, he was not trying to defend his actions. He was trying to understand them. The balance of the moment had changed. The visitor who had been questioned was now surrounded by recognition and respect. But Elijah knew the most important part of the lesson had not arrived yet. A name could change how people treated someone. A title could open doors. But the real test of character was how people treated others before they knew the name, the title, or the story behind them. The entrance of Fort Harrison Military Base had become a place of reflection rather than confusion. Moments earlier, Officer Ryan Mitchell believed he was dealing with a simple security concern. Now, he stood face to face with a reality he never expected. The quiet visitor he questioned was not an ordinary guest. He was General Elijah Carter, a 4-star Army leader whose service had earned the respect of countless soldiers across the country. But even after the truth was revealed, Elijah remained the same person he had been from the beginning. He did not use his position to embarrass Ryan. He did not raise his voice. He did not demand apologies. Instead, he looked at the situation as a leader would. He wanted to understand it. Around them, more personnel began arriving near the entrance. Not because there was a crisis, but because word had spread that General Carter was there. Soldiers who had worked under his guidance recognized him immediately. Some remembered his speeches. Others remembered the lessons he shared about leadership and responsibility. They did not gather because of his title alone. They gathered because of what that title represented. Years of commitment, years of service, years of putting others before himself. Ryan watched as the atmosphere changed around him. The same people who had been standing quietly moments earlier now showed a deep level of respect toward Elijah. The difference was not that Elijah had suddenly become important. He had always been important. The difference was that people could finally see what had been hidden from them. Ryan looked back at the beginning of the encounter and realized something uncomfortable. He had treated the situation based on what he assumed instead of what he knew. He had focused on what Elijah was not wearing instead of what Elijah had spent his life doing. He saw a person without a uniform and failed to see the person behind the uniform he had earned. Elijah noticed the change in Ryan's expression. He understood that this moment was not easy for the officer. Realizing a mistake could be difficult, especially when someone believed they were simply doing their job. But Elijah also knew that growth often began with honest reflection. "Officer Mitchell," Elijah said calmly, "everyone makes judgments in a moment. The important thing is whether we are willing to examine those judgments afterward." Ryan listened carefully. The words did not sound like a lecture. They sounded like advice from someone who had spent a lifetime learning about responsibility. Colonel Thomas Walker stood nearby, watching the interaction. He had seen many leaders during his career, but moments like this revealed the difference between having authority and understanding it. Elijah had every opportunity to make the situation about himself. Instead, he made it about a lesson that could help others. As more members of the base gathered, the truth became impossible to ignore. The man who had been questioned at the entrance was the same man many of them respected. The man who had been underestimated was the same man who had dedicated his life to serving others. Yet Elijah knew the greatest lesson was not about his rank. It was about every person who had watched what happened. Because one day, any of them could be the person standing on either side of that moment. The person making an assumption, or the person hoping someone would take the time to understand. And as the base surrounded him with recognition, Elijah Carter understood that this was not a victory over another person. It was an opportunity to remind everyone that respect should never depend on discovering someone's title. It should exist from the very beginning. The presence of General Elijah Carter at Fort Harrison Military Base had changed the atmosphere completely, but the greatest change was not the number of people who recognized him. It was the way everyone began to think about the moment that had happened at the entrance. Soldiers stood nearby with quiet respect, not because a powerful person had arrived, but because they understood the meaning behind the person standing before them. Elijah had spent decades building trust through his actions, and that trust was something no title alone could create. Colonel Thomas Walker looked around at the gathered personnel and understood that this moment carried a lesson beyond the entrance gate. Everyone had seen how quickly a person could be misunderstood when only a small part of their story was visible. Ryan Mitchell stood quietly, taking in everything around him. The confidence he had carried earlier was gone. In its place was reflection. He looked at Elijah and realized that the most important part of the encounter was not discovering that Elijah was a 4-star general. The important part was understanding that the way he treated Elijah before knowing his identity was the real measure of his character. Elijah noticed Ryan's silence and spoke calmly. "Officer Mitchell, there is something every leader learns eventually. The way we treat people when we think they have no influence tells us the most about who we are." Ryan listened carefully. Those words stayed with him because they reached beyond the situation at the gate. They were not only about one conversation. They were about every interaction where someone makes a decision about another person without knowing the full story. Around them, several soldiers who had served under Elijah shared quiet memories. They remembered a leader who took time to listen. They remembered someone who treated every person with respect regardless of rank. They remembered that Elijah's reputation was not built because of the stars on his uniform. It was built because of the people who trusted him. A young soldier approached and respectfully greeted Elijah. He explained that many members of the base had learned from his leadership over the years. Elijah smiled and thanked him, reminding him that leadership was never about being above others. It was about being responsible for others. Ryan watched this exchange and understood something important. The respect surrounding Elijah was not created by fear. It was created by trust. That was the difference between authority and true leadership. Authority could make people follow instructions. Leadership made people believe in a purpose. As the morning continued, the story of what happened at the entrance spread throughout the base. People did not focus only on the fact that a general had been questioned. They focused on the lesson that came from it. A person's appearance could never tell the entire story. A person's clothing could never reveal their entire journey. And a person's silence could never be mistaken for weakness. Elijah eventually prepared to continue his scheduled visit. The responsibilities waiting for him had not changed. The meetings, the discussions, and the decisions ahead were still important. But before leaving the entrance area, he looked back at Ryan one more time. There was no anger in his expression, only understanding. "The strongest organizations are built by people who are willing to learn," Elijah said. Ryan nodded quietly. For the first time that morning, he understood that this moment was not about being defeated by someone with a higher rank. It was about recognizing a lesson from someone with greater experience. As Elijah walked toward the center of the base, the people watching did not see only a 4-star general. They saw a reminder that true greatness is not announced by a title. It is revealed through the way a person treats others when they have every reason to act differently. The events at Fort Harrison Military Base continued to influence everyone who had witnessed them. What began as a simple interaction at the entrance became a moment of reflection for an entire community. But for General Elijah Carter, the most important part was never the attention. It was the opportunity to understand what could be learned from the situation. Later that day, Elijah sat with several senior leaders inside the base. The conversation was not focused on personal frustration or embarrassment. Instead, it focused on responsibility, awareness, and the importance of maintaining trust between people and institutions. Elijah knew that every organization faced moments when its values were tested. The difference between a strong organization and a weak one was whether people were willing to examine those moments honestly. "Leadership is not proven when everything goes perfectly," Elijah explained. "Leadership is proven when we recognize what needs to improve." Those words reflected the same approach he had carried throughout his military career. He had never believed that mistakes should be ignored. He believed they should become opportunities to grow. Outside the meeting room, Officer Ryan Mitchell continued thinking about the encounter. The more he reflected, the more he understood that the most important lesson was not about Elijah's rank. It was about how quickly assumptions had shaped his first reaction. Ryan had believed he was protecting the base, but he realized that protection required more than following procedures. It required understanding people. It required patience. It required fairness. A few days later, Ryan had the opportunity to speak with Elijah again. The conversation was different this time. There was no confusion. No uncertainty. Only two people discussing a lesson that had affected them both. General Carter, Ryan said, I have been thinking about what happened. I understand now that knowing someone's position should not be the reason we treat them with respect. Respect should come first. Elijah listened carefully and nodded. That understanding is what matters, he replied. Everyone deserves to be treated with dignity before their background, title, or achievements are known. The conversation was not about one person being right and another being wrong. It was about recognizing how people can improve when they are willing to look honestly at their own actions. Ryan understood that his responsibility as an officer was not only to enforce rules. It was to represent the principles behind those rules. Meanwhile, Elijah continued his work at the base. He attended meetings, spoke with soldiers, and shared lessons about leadership. He never mentioned the attention that came from the incident. He never used the moment as a personal achievement. For him, the true value came from what others could learn. The story eventually became known among many people at Fort Harrison. But the part they remembered most was not that a general had been questioned. It was that the general responded with patience instead of pride. He had shown that having power did not mean needing to display it. It meant having the discipline to use it responsibly. As the days passed, the entrance where the misunderstanding began returned to its normal routine. Soldiers continued their duties. Visitors continued arriving. The base continued moving forward. But for those who knew what happened there, the place carried a different meaning. It became a reminder that every person has a story beyond what others can immediately see. And sometimes, the greatest lessons come from the moments when people are given the chance to see beyond the surface. The days after the encounter at Fort Harrison military base passed quietly. But the lesson from that morning continued to remain in the minds of everyone who witnessed it. For most people, life returned to its normal rhythm. Soldiers continued their training. Officers continued their responsibilities. Visitors continued arriving through the same entrance where the misunderstanding had taken place. Yet for those who were there, that location represented something much deeper. It became a reminder that a person's true identity is not always visible at first glance. General Elijah Carter continued his work with the same dedication he had shown throughout his career. He never viewed the moment at the gate as a personal victory. He never saw it as an opportunity to prove that he was more important than someone else. Instead, he saw it as a chance to remind people of something simple but powerful. Every person deserves to be treated with respect before their achievements, position, or background are known. Throughout his years in the United States Army, Elijah had learned that leadership was not about receiving recognition. It was about accepting responsibility. It was about understanding that every decision, every conversation, and every interaction could influence others. That lesson was not only for generals or commanders. It was for everyone. Officer Ryan Mitchell carried that lesson with him as well. The experience changed the way he approached his role. He became more aware of the importance of listening before making conclusions. He understood that procedures were necessary, but procedures alone could never replace good judgment. A person could follow every rule and still forget the human being standing in front of them. Ryan realized that true professionalism required both discipline and understanding. Several weeks later, a group of younger soldiers attended a leadership discussion where Elijah shared his thoughts about service. He did not talk about the day he was questioned. He did not mention the attention surrounding the event. Instead, he focused on the values that had guided him for decades. The uniform is important, Elijah told them, but the person wearing it matters even more. The soldiers listened carefully because they understood that those words came from experience, not theory. Elijah had spent his life learning that respect was something people gave before they received anything in return. As the discussion ended, one soldier asked Elijah what the greatest lesson of leadership was. He paused for a moment before answering. The greatest leaders never forget that every person they meet has a story they do not know. Those words captured everything that had happened outside the entrance of Fort Harrison. A moment that began with assumptions ended with understanding. A situation that could have created division became a reminder of the importance of patience and fairness. The story was never truly about a rank, a uniform, or a position. It was about a choice. The choice to judge quickly or to understand deeply. The choice to use authority for control or to use it for responsibility. The choice to see a person before seeing a label. Years later, those who remembered that morning did not focus only on the fact that a 4-star general had been misunderstood. They remembered how he responded. They remembered his calm voice. They remembered his patience. They remembered that real strength did not need to announce itself. Because in the end, the greatest measure of a person is not the title they carry or the power they hold. It is the respect they show when nobody is watching. And that was the lesson General Elijah Carter left behind. True leadership is not proven by how many people know your name. It is proven by how many people feel valued after meeting you.